Bayview Oaks was, by all external measures, the perfect suburban enclave. Rows of stately oaks lined the sidewalks. Large two-story houses displayed trimmed hedges and vibrant flower gardens, and neat driveways revealed little sign of disorder. If one strolled through the neighborhood at twilight, they would see the glow of porch lights, families eating dinner, and children finishing up playtime before bed. There was a sense of gentle camaraderie among neighbors, potlucks, community gatherings, and friendly waves. Overseeing the governance of Bayview Oaks was the local Homeowners Association, HOA, which handled everything from lawn care requirements to architectural guidelines. Though the HOA was occasionally strict, it ran smoothly under the steady leadership of a small board. Because the neighborhood was home to many retirees and professionals with families, the HOA generally found solutions that balanced rules with compassion. But not all board members were so balanced. Enter Delilah Masterson, known behind her back as Karen for her persistent meddling, unwavering self-importance, and habit of imposing her personal taste on everyone around her. Delilah had been on the HOA board for nearly 4 years and took immense pride in protecting property values. She was the first to notice if a trash bin stayed on the curb too long, if a lawn sprouted even a few extra weeds, or if a decorative mailbox didn't match the regulated palette of neutral colors. Many neighbors found her constant scrutiny exhausting. Little did they know, Delilah was about to test the community's patience in ways no one had yet imagined. Her target? A newly installed wheelchair lift belonging to a resident who truly needed it. Delilah's militant sense of neighborhood aesthetics would collide headlong with the moral imperative of accessibility. The trouble began innocently enough on a warm spring morning when Alexander Fairchild, a semi-retired architect, moved into the house at 24 Sycamore Lane. He was accompanied by his adult daughter, Lauren, who planned to live with him temporarily. Alexander had recently suffered complications from a spinal condition that required him to use a wheelchair. Though he retained partial mobility, climbing steps was out of the question. The previous owners of 24 Sycamore Lane had a wide, welcoming porch that led to a classic front door with a brass knocker. However, the porch itself was elevated by a set of 5 stairs. Lauren, anticipating her father's needs, arranged for a reputable contractor to install a compact, vertical wheelchair lift right at the side of the porch. It was a straightforward piece of machinery, designed to blend in with the existing architecture as much as possible. During the move-in process, trucks came and went, bearing furniture and boxes. Neighbors paused on their morning walks to wave politely. Some offered tips about the best local bakeries or asked if the Fairchilds needed any help. Alexander, grateful for the warm reception, returned each greeting with a smile. But at the far side of the street, behind the half-lowered blinds of her pristine bay window, Delilah Masterson watched. She noticed how the contractors then spent hours installing what looked like a mechanical device on the new neighbor's porch. She felt an immediate surge of disapproval. After all, she had worked so hard to maintain the classic southern porch aesthetic that Bayview Oaks prided itself on. In Delilah's eyes, this new contraption was a blemish, a metal and glass eyesore that would tarnish the harmonious facade of Sycamore Lane. That same afternoon, as Lauren guided her father up the newly installed lift for the first time, Delilah strolled over. Her posture was stiff, her beige cardigan zipped with meticulous neatness, and her lips pressed so tightly they nearly vanished. "Good afternoon," she said, eyeing the lift with undisguised concern. "Are you the new owners?" Lauren turned, pleasantly surprised. "Hello. We just moved in, yes. I'm Lauren, and this is my father, Alexander. Nice to meet you." "Likewise," Delilah said curtly. She pointed to the metal rail of the lift. "That device, is it permanent?" Lauren glanced at her father. He kept a polite expression, though a flicker of apprehension crossed his eyes. "It's a wheelchair lift," Lauren explained, a note of caution in her voice. "We installed it so Dad can enter the house without climbing stairs. He needs it for mobility." Delilah nodded slowly but offered no warmth. I see," she murmured. Then, with a thin smile, "Well, welcome to Bayview Oaks. If you have any questions about our regulations, I happen to be on the HOA board. I'm sure you've read through the architectural guidelines, correct?" Lauren nodded. "Yes, we reviewed the guidelines. We believe we're in compliance. This lift doesn't obstruct the sidewalk or encroach on anyone else's property. and we've matched the color to the trim of the house to be as subtle as possible. Delilah gave a perfunctory smile. Yes, very subtle. Her gaze lingered with an air of discontent before she added, I'll see you at the next HOA meeting, I'm sure. With that, she turned and walked off, leaving Lauren and Alexander slightly uneasy, unsure of just how deep this tension would run. Delilah didn't waste time. Within days, she submitted a formal email to the other HOA board members, labeling the wheelchair lift as a potential violation of the neighborhood's aesthetic code. She also voiced her concern that the device might lower neighboring property values. Philip Hensley, the HOA president, read Delilah's email with a frown. He had served as president for nearly 6 years, attempting to balance strict rules with empathy. The tone of Delilah's complaint set off alarm bells. She wrote phrases like metal contraption and unsightly intrusion that betrayed a personal bias. He decided to call an informal meeting of the board to discuss the matter. When the board convened, comprised of Philip, Delilah, a kind-hearted retiree named Eloise Gardner, an easygoing father of 2 named Tom Castillo, and a detail-focused local accountant named Richard Lee, the atmosphere felt strained. Delilah repeated her concerns with a solemn expression, claiming that the lift had been foisted upon the neighborhood without a thorough review. Eloise gently pushed back. I believe, per the Americans with Disabilities Act guidelines, we should be supportive of accessibility improvements. Is there a specific rule that the Fairchilds have broken? Delilah pursed her lips. It's not that they've broken a rule, per SC. But we do have clauses about maintaining architectural integrity and preserving the uniform porch style. That mechanical device is hardly in keeping with our community's historic character. Richard steepled his fingers. Yes, but we also have guidelines allowing necessary modifications for medical or disability purposes. I recall an addition last year for ramp access at Mrs. Patel's home, which was allowed with no issue. Delilah waved a hand dismissively. That was a small ramp at the back entrance, out of public view. This lift is right on the front porch. Everyone can see it. I simply propose we ask them to move it or remove it. Perhaps the father could use a back entrance instead. Tom Castillo frowned. We can't demand that. The design guidelines can't supersede ADA or local accessibility laws. We should at least talk to the Fairchilds, see if there's a reason they placed it in front. Delilah pressed on, conjuring ominous predictions. If we let anyone install such machinery, soon we'll have front yard elevators, half-finished projects that sit rusting. Anarchy. We must enforce our standards. The rest of you may not see it, but property values are at stake. Philip, sensing that this was more about Delilah's personal preferences than real compliance, ended the discussion tactfully. Let's do this. I'll speak directly to the Fairchilds. We'll check if they filed the correct modification form, and if everything is in order, the board will stand down. If we discover a glaring violation, we'll address it. Sound fair? He gave Delilah a meaningful glance, silently reminding her that an ADA-compliant lift was not the same as a decorative mailbox. Delilah forced a smile, though the tension in her jaw was telling. While the HOA board debated, Alexander Fairchild and his daughter Lauren tried to settle into their new home. Boxes lay scattered around the living room, waiting to be unpacked. Family photos, glass vases, and books remained neatly wrapped in newspaper. When the day ended, Alexander would guide his wheelchair to the base of the new lift, press a button, and glide up onto the porch. For him, it was an elegant solution, a device that restored a measure of independence. The physical pain from his spinal condition often drained his energy by late afternoon, but Alexander was determined to maintain a sense of normalcy. He had always been active, designing houses and traveling. Losing mobility had been a harsh blow to his pride and freedom. The lift represented a symbolic victory. Even in a wheelchair, he could arrive through the front door like anyone else. Lauren had worries of her own. She worked remotely as a software developer, alternating between the cluttered new office and the dining room table. Between calls and code, she'd arrange boxes or fix lunch for her father. But her mind kept returning to the initial encounter with Delilah. She suspected that a confrontation was brewing. One Thursday afternoon, a friendly neighbor named Margaret Lou came by with a plate of homemade cookies. As the two women chatted on the porch, Margaret lowered her voice conspiratorially. I don't mean to stir the pot, but I've heard Delilah, one of the HOA folks, talking about your father's lift in not-so-kind terms. She's complaining that it disrupts the visual uniformity of our homes. Lauren's face fell. Oh, we had a feeling. She came by once to question it. We tried to comply with all guidelines. Margaret sighed. Delilah's always fussing over something. Once, she made a big deal because I grew pink roses that she claimed clashed with my shutters. But be prepared. She can be persistent. Thanks for the warning, Lauren said, managing a smile. We just want Dad to have an easy, dignified way in and out. I can't believe it's that big of a deal to others. Margaret shrugged. I'm on your side. Accessibility should come before aesthetics. But, you know how some people are. She left the cookies, gave Lauren a reassuring pat on the arm, and headed home. That night, Alexander read the local HOA guidelines again, double-checking the addendum for disability accommodations. Everything seemed in order, but a knot of anxiety twisted in his chest. He couldn't fight off the feeling that a battle with the HOA, perhaps with Delilah at its forefront, was imminent. The question wasn't if, but when. A week later, the challenge arrived in the form of a sharply worded letter on the Fairchild's doorstep. It bore the HOA's official letterhead, though the content itself reeked of Delilah's trademark style. The letter cited concerns raised by multiple residents about the wheelchair lift's compliance with design aesthetics. It requested that Alexander and Lauren attend a special hearing at the next board meeting to discuss possible remedies, including relocation of the lift or re-engineering it to be less visible. Lauren read the letter aloud at the kitchen table, incredulous. Alexander rubbed his temples. They can't force us to tear it out, can they? He asked, worry creasing his brow. Legally, I don't believe so, Lauren replied. The guidelines mention we have every right to make accessibility modifications, but we might have a fight on our hands. I'll gather documents to prove we're in compliance with disability laws. At that moment, the phone rang. Lauren answered. It was Philip Hensley, the HOA president. His voice was apologetic. Lauren, I'm sorry about the letter. I did not fully endorse that approach, but Delilah is pushing this item onto the board's agenda. I want you to know I'll do my best to keep things fair. Thank you. Lauren sighed, relieved that someone on the board was sympathetic. It would help if you came prepared to show that the lift meets local code and that it was installed by a licensed contractor, Philip continued. The board is mostly supportive, but we do have to address the motion Delilah filed. Official procedure. Sometimes Delilah confuses personal preference with community standards. Lauren thanked him and hung up, feeling marginally better. At least she and her father had an ally in Philip. Still, a hearing was no small matter. She busied herself with rummaging through their records, contractor invoices, building permits, the official manual for the lift, and the relevant passages of the HOA bylaws. Meanwhile, Alexander typed up a short statement about why the lift was essential, hoping a personal plea might soften any harsh critiques. They had a week to prepare. Friends and neighbors, upon hearing the news, rallied around the Fairchilds. Margaret Liu offered to speak at the meeting in their defense. A couple of other residents who had elderly relatives also expressed support. The stage was set for a tense showdown at the next board meeting. On a mild Tuesday evening, the Bayview Oaks Community Center bustled with more attendees than usual. Word had spread that a heated debate was on the agenda, Delilah's formal challenge to the Fairchild's wheelchair lift. Residents who typically ignored HOA politics showed up out of curiosity. Some came out of solidarity for Alexander and Lauren, while others were simply drawn to the drama. The meeting began with routine matters, a budget review, landscaping updates, and a quick note about the upcoming 4th of July neighborhood picnic. Delilah rushed through these items with palpable impatience, glancing repeatedly at her prepared notes. Finally, Philip announced, next on the agenda, the board will discuss the complaint filed regarding the wheelchair lift at 24 Sycamore Lane. Mr. Fairchild and Ms. Fairchild, please come forward. Lauren and Alexander wheeled to the front. Alexander's face was calm but resolute, while Lauren held a folder of documents. Delilah stood, clearing her throat in an officious manner. Thank you for attending, she said, gesturing to them with a tight smile. We appreciate your cooperation in clarifying the matters surrounding this installation. Would you like to present your side first? Philip offered, giving Lauren a nod. She stepped forward. We moved here a few weeks ago. My father requires a wheelchair lift for safe and independent access to the front door. We consulted the HOA guidelines before installation, as well as local building codes, and found no explicit prohibition on a front entry lift. Our licensed contractor ensured everything met safety standards. Lauren handed copies of the permit and contractor documentation to the board members, who flipped through them silently. Alexander added, his voice steady. It's a necessary device, not a decorative choice. I can't climb stairs. This is my home now, and entering through the back or side is not always feasible. I'd like the same dignity in using the front entrance that everyone else enjoys. A faint ripple of sympathy stirred among the audience. Some people nodded in agreement. Delilah, however, launched into her rebuttal. While we respect Mr. Fairchild's condition, Bayview Oaks prides itself on a cohesive architectural look. The lift is visible from the road, clashing with the front porch design. Neighbors have expressed alarm over how it might lower property values or set a precedent for mechanical additions in plain sight. She produced a set of photographs taken from various angles, a slightly distorted lens that made the lift appear larger and more intrusive than it was. She distributed them to the board, saying, "As you can see, this metal structure disrupts the uniform aesthetic we strive for. My proposed solution is to relocate it to a rear entrance. Or if the owners insist on front accessibility, then we ask they install screening or some alternative that keeps it hidden." Alexander bit his lip. He glanced at Lauren, who flipped through her own binder. She found the relevant statement in the HOA's bylaw addendum and read it aloud. If a homeowner requires structural modifications to accommodate a permanent disability, the HOA shall not unreasonably withhold approval, provided the modification does not pose a safety hazard or encroach upon neighboring properties. She let that last phrase sink in, then continued, "We're not encroaching on any neighbor's land, and there's no hazard here. So by the HOA's own language, we've complied." Philip nodded slowly. "Delilah, Miss Fairchild has a point." But Delilah was ready. "The bylaw states, shall not unreasonably withhold approval, but it also mentions that modifications must be in harmony with the overall design. I argue that a bulky metal lift is not in harmony. We can't just disregard the aesthetic component." The debate raged for nearly an hour. Eloise Gardner asked if some sort of decorative railing or enclosure might satisfy both sides. Tom Castillo suggested allowing the lift to remain as is, given it was a genuine medical need. The audience murmured, with a few residents stepping up to voice support for the Fairchilds. One or two joined Delilah in lamenting the lift's appearance, but they were in the minority. Finally, Philip called for a pause. "Given the complexity, I move that we schedule an on-site inspection to see if a compromise can be found, perhaps a partial enclosure. We can then vote on a resolution. In the meantime, Mr. Fairchild, you may continue using the lift, pending the final decision." A wave of relief swept over Lauren and Alexander. At least they weren't facing an immediate removal order. Delilah, however, kept her arms folded, her jaw set. She said nothing, but the storm in her eyes made it clear she had only begun to fight. In the days after the meeting, a noticeable groundswell of neighborly support emerged for Alexander and Lauren. The spectacle at the HOA gathering had shaken many residents who, until then, hadn't fully registered how petty or aggressive Delilah's campaigns could become. Stories floated around about her previous compliance crackdowns, but few had been so personal or so morally gray as targeting a man's wheelchair lift. Lauren, inspired by the wave of sympathy, organized an informal gathering at her home one Saturday afternoon. She invited about a dozen residents, some who had been at the meeting and others who simply wanted to learn more. Over iced tea and finger foods, they discussed possible ways to ensure the lift remained unharassed. Margaret Liu spoke first. "I think we should show the board, especially Delilah, how many of us actively support the lift. Maybe if we gather signatures or statements, the board will see that the concerns Delilah claims to represent aren't really widespread." Henry O'Donnell, an older gentleman with a walking cane, chimed in, "I don't need a wheelchair, but as I get older, I might need my own ramp or lift. If Delilah sets a precedent that accessibility features can be vetoed, that's scary. I'll sign any petition." Dina Rodriguez, a mother of 3, agreed. "We're lucky to have a strong, inclusive community. Imagine how outsiders would see us if we forced a man in a wheelchair to use the back door. That's not the Bayview Oaks I know." A flurry of ideas followed, drafting a petition, presenting a slideshow of accessible design solutions, or contacting an attorney specializing in disability rights if the HOA escalated. Some even proposed that the lift could be beautified, maybe with potted plants or some tasteful enclosure that matched the house's trim. Alexander, feeling a bit overwhelmed by the outpouring, expressed gratitude. I don't want to stir up drama, but I appreciate your willingness to stand with me. I don't mind exploring ways to make the lift more discreet, as long as it remains fully functional. Lauren nodded in agreement. Yes, we want to show we're reasonable. We'll do our best to respect the neighborhood's look. We just won't sacrifice Dad's right to access his own front door. By the evening's end, the group had formed a plan. They would present a united front at the on-site inspection, which Philip had scheduled for the following week. They drafted a brief letter emphasizing inclusivity and compassion. Nearly 30 neighbors had already agreed to sign it. Lauren felt hopeful. Maybe reason and decency would prevail against Delilah's crusade. On a warm Tuesday morning, the HOA board arrived at 24 Sycamore Lane for their on-site inspection. Philip, Eloise, Tom, and Richard came in one car. Delilah arrived separately, looking prim in a tailored navy blazer. Lauren greeted them at the porch steps, while Alexander waited in his wheelchair just inside the house. Delilah wasted no time circling the lift like a hawk. She ran her fingers along the metal framework, pointed out the motor housing, and took photos from various angles. The rest of the board watched, faintly embarrassed by her fervor. Look here, Delilah said, tapping the base. It's bolted straight into the porch floor. This is definitely permanent. Richard Lee, the accountant, sighed. Of course it's permanent. It needs to be stable. It's a mobility device, not a folding chair. Delilah turned to the group. I remain convinced we can relocate it around back. This is the front facade, our prime neighborhood real estate. Lauren, standing next to Eloise, gently interjected. Please come inside so my father can speak with you directly. We have refreshments, too. Inside, Alexander sat near the doorway. He welcomed the board with a polite smile. Thank you for coming. I'd be happy to explain the reasons behind choosing the front porch. The property's rear entrance is narrower, and it leads into a cramped mudroom with steps inside. That would be just as challenging. Philip nodded in understanding. Tom Castillo asked a few practical questions about the device's noise level and any potential safety issues. Alexander assured them the motor was very quiet, and the lift had safety features like an emergency stop. He even demonstrated pressing the button to descend. The motor emitted only a soft hum, hardly noticeable unless one stood right beside it. Delilah watched the demonstration with pursed lips. She seemed unswayed. But something unexpected happened next. A neighbor named Jacob Hastings, who no one realized was a building inspector for the county, happened to stop by. He was returning a borrowed ladder, so he tapped on the open door, recognized the board members, and politely said hello. Oh, Jacob, Philip said, smiling. We're just checking on the Fairchild's lift. You work in building code compliance, don't you? Jacob nodded. Yes, for the county's planning department. I've seen many of these lifts. In fact, I reviewed the contractor's permit. It meets all local and state codes. He walked over to the porch and examined the installation. Looks good, top-notch job. It's about as discreet as a vertical lift can be. And from an ADA standpoint, you're well within your rights to install it. The county encourages accessibility enhancements. Delilah's face clouded as Jacob's endorsement carried genuine authority. If a county inspector said the device was compliant and not an eyesore, how could she push for removal? But she had one last card to play, the question of aesthetics. Well, code compliance is one thing, she sniffed, but it doesn't address the stylings of our neighborhood. That's still within the HOA's domain. Jacob shrugged, nonplussed. True, but usually HOAs can't override essential accessibility accommodations. I've yet to see a case where the law sided against the homeowner needing a wheelchair lift. At that, Tom and Eloise exchanged glances, relief evident in their eyes. Delilah, flustered, wrapped up the inspection by stating she'd present a final recommendation at the next board meeting. She left in a hurry, ignoring Lauren's offer of a cold drink. As the board members departed, Philip leaned over to Alexander. Don't worry. We'll do the official vote soon, but it's looking positive for you. Alexander smiled, genuinely touched by the support. Little did he know that Delilah wasn't about to concede. She was about to up the ante with a harsh tactic that threatened to drag the entire community into a bitter dispute. 3 days later, an ominous letter appeared in the Fairchild's mailbox, a formal notice of violation, citing obscure references to the HOA's uniform facade doctrine. It listed the wheelchair lift as an unauthorized mechanical addition that disrupts the facade continuum. The letter demanded that Alexander and Lauren either remove or relocate the device within 30 days. Failure to comply would trigger daily fines, culminating in a potential lien on their property. Lauren stood at the kitchen counter, reading the letter twice to ensure she wasn't hallucinating. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her cheeks flushed. "They haven't even voted yet. How can they fine us preemptively?" Alexander wheeled over, scanning the text. "It's signed by Delilah alone. There's no mention of the rest of the board. Isn't that improper?" Lauren's phone rang. Margaret Liu was on the line, her voice anxious. "I just saw Delilah walking door to door, handing out flyers about your lift. She's calling an emergency meeting next week to resolve the violation. I think she's trying to strong-arm a vote." A wave of anger and helplessness washed over Lauren. She can't do that on her own. The board has to vote as a group, right? She's probably hoping to stir up enough fear among neighbors that the board will feel pressured, Margaret said. Or maybe she's bluffing. But you know how she is. Don't let her intimidate you. After the call ended, Lauren took a few deep breaths. She made a quick decision. It was time to contact a lawyer. While she didn't want a protracted legal battle, Delilah was escalating beyond the normal scope of HOA disagreements. That very afternoon, Lauren found a local attorney who specialized in homeowners' rights and disability accommodations. She emailed him a summary, attaching the notice of violation, the bylaw excerpt about disability modifications, and a timeline of events. Within a day, the attorney replied that the letter was likely unenforceable if not backed by an official board vote. He also noted that the Fairchilds had strong protections under state and federal law. Encouraged, Lauren and Alexander prepared for the emergency meeting with renewed resolve. They had the law on their side, a supportive community, and a board that seemed mostly sympathetic. But they understood that Delilah wouldn't retreat without a fight, and she was cunning enough to manipulate emotions. They braced themselves for the upcoming confrontation. In the run-up to the emergency meeting, the Fairchilds were pleasantly surprised by the number of neighbors who knocked on their door to offer help or words of encouragement. Some left homemade food or wrote supportive notes. Others volunteered to speak on their behalf. Mary Weaver, a longtime resident, shared a personal story. "I cared for my mother who used a wheelchair. She couldn't leave the house without a ramp. I wish the HOA had shown us half the kindness they're showing you now. Back then, a few members gave me grief for building a side ramp. Delilah wasn't on the board yet, but if she had been, oh boy." Mary signed the petition in favor of the Fairchilds lift. Richard Brown, a local pastor, did the same, adding a heartfelt comment. "Accessibility is a moral imperative." Even some who might have been neutral or disliked the device's aesthetics felt Delilah had gone too far by issuing a unilateral notice of violation. The day before the meeting, Philip Hensley visited 24 Sycamore Lane to reassure them that the letter was not an official board directive. "It appears Delilah typed this up on her own. She's claiming some old subclause in the bylaws about facade uniformity, but I doubt the rest of the board will stand with her. Don't panic, okay?" He also hinted that Eloise and Tom were outraged by Delilah's overreach. "I believe we have the votes to dismiss this. Just show up, present your evidence, and we'll handle it." Alexander breathed a sigh of relief, though a coil of tension remained in his stomach. Lauren noticed her father's restless nights. She, too, lost sleep. The idea that one person could disrupt their lives so severely was unsettling. Still, they felt buoyed by the kindness of strangers and the moral clarity of their cause. The community center was packed. Bayview Oaks residents filled the chairs and lined the walls. Word had traveled fast about the notice of violation, fueling speculation that Delilah might attempt a strong-armed approach to get rid of the wheelchair lift. At the front sat the 5 board members: Philip, Eloise, Tom, Richard, and Delilah. Each had a microphone before them. Delilah wore a crisp gray suit, her hair pulled tight in a bun, exuding an air of authority. Philip cleared his throat, calling the meeting to order. Tonight's emergency session was requested by Ms. Masterson. He used Delilah's formal surname, to address an alleged violation at 24 Sycamore Lane. However, I want to clarify from the start that the board as a whole did not collectively authorize the notice of violation that was recently delivered. Delilah's lips compressed, but she said nothing, letting Philip continue. We will allow Ms. Masterson to present her case, then hear from the Fairchilds. After that, the board will vote on a resolution, Philip explained. Delilah seized the microphone. Thank you, Mr. President. My actions were taken to preserve the architectural standards of Bayview Oaks. The lift at 24 Sycamore is a mechanical device that visually clashes with the existing porch design. Numerous residents have expressed alarm to me personally. I believe we must correct this for the integrity of our community. She produced a large poster board with more photos, again, taken at angles that exaggerated the lift's prominence. She talked of property values plummeting and the slippery slope of unregulated mechanical additions. A few members of the audience rolled their eyes. Some whispered among themselves that this was all fear-mongering. When she finished, Philip gave the floor to the Fairchilds. Lauren stood first, microphone in hand, determined to be calm but firm. We have complied with every official guideline, and we have the right to an accessible front entrance under state and federal law. This is not a whim or a piece of decor. It's a medical necessity for my father. Alexander spoke next, describing his condition and emphasizing how crucial the lift was for his daily life. I'm asking for understanding and compassion. If there's a way to make it more visually appealing, we are open to suggestions. But removing or hiding it away in the back is not feasible. Next came a parade of neighbors stepping up to the public comment microphone. Margaret Liu read a statement signed by over 50 residents affirming their support. Jacob Hastings reiterated that the device met all local codes. Mary Weaver described her past struggles caring for a disabled mother. Each testimony chipped away at Delilah's argument that the community demanded removal. It was increasingly apparent that Delilah's real grievance was personal preference, not broad consensus. Eloise Gardner cleared her throat, looking genuinely moved by the testimonials. I'd like to propose that we find a compromise, some decorative enclosure, landscaping, or a small arbor that might mask the mechanical aspect while allowing full accessibility. Would that be amenable to the Fairchilds? Alexander nodded, glancing at Lauren. We'd be thrilled to explore such options. We just need to make sure the lift remains safe to operate. Philip turned to Delilah. How about you, Ms. Masterson? Does that address your aesthetic concerns? Delilah hesitated, her face a storm of resentment. She realized that the tide was against her. Reluctantly, she said, I suppose we can consider some type of screening structure, if it blends with the house. But we need strict guidelines, no half-baked solution. The board promptly called for a vote on a resolution allowing the lift to stay, on the condition that the Fairchilds and the HOA's architectural subcommittee, minus Delilah, presumably, collaborate on an aesthetically pleasing enclosure or screening. The resolution passed 4-1, with Delilah being the lone dissent. Cheers erupted. Lauren and Alexander hugged each other. Many in the audience applauded the victory of common sense. Delilah, tight-lipped, gathered her documents and left the stage. A handful of her supporters trailed after her, though it was clear their numbers were small. The meeting ended on a hopeful note. True to their word, Alexander and Lauren began brainstorming ways to make the lift more attractive. They researched everything from wooden panel enclosures to custom lattice frames. It was important that any coverings still allow the lift's platform to move freely and meet safety codes. Then, one afternoon, Lauren found inspiration in an online forum about universal design. A user mentioned concealing a residential wheelchair ramp with a trellis of climbing vines. Another posted photos of a small porch lift surrounded by a wooden arbor draped in flowering plants. The effect was both functional and beautiful. Lauren proposed the idea to her father. What if we built a light arbor structure, an open frame around the lift, anchored securely to the porch? Then we could train climbing roses or a similar vine up the sides. It would mask the metal, turning it into a garden feature. Alexander's eyes lit up. A flower arbor? That could be lovely. I used to design houses with integrated landscaping. This would be right up my alley. They consulted with a local contractor who specialized in pergolas and arbors. He confirmed that a modest wooden frame could be installed around the lift without interfering with its operation. They picked a design that matched the house's architecture, using the same color palette as the porch rails. The contractor suggested a climbing rose variety known for abundant blooms and minimal thorns. Before proceeding, Alexander contacted Philip and the rest of the architectural subcommittee. They loved the concept, praising it as a win-win, preserving accessibility while enhancing curb appeal. Even Tom Castillo joked, "Delilah can't possibly hate flowers, right?" Work began swiftly. Within a week, a framework of sturdy cedar posts rose around the lift. Each post connected at the top with a series of graceful arches. The structure was open on the sides, allowing the lift to move without obstructions, yet partial lattice panels would eventually guide climbing vines. Lauren and Alexander planned to add well-tended flower beds at the base. The entire arrangement would make the mechanical apparatus recede into a lush, living landscape. As neighbors passed by, they offered encouraging comments. Some even donated potted plants or decorative stones to help beautify the space. The atmosphere was one of shared pride. Little by little, the metal lift that had caused such controversy morphed into an elegant garden focal point. While most of Bayview Oaks admired the Arbor project, Delilah seethed in private. She had staked her reputation on removing the lift and now saw the neighborhood rally behind it instead. The sight of a blossoming arbor around the ugly machinery felt like a personal defeat. One Saturday morning, she marched up to the construction site, arms crossed, surveying the half-finished structure. The contractor, a friendly man named Jorge, paused mid-hammer to greet her. She ignored his pleasantries. "What exactly are you building here?" she demanded, her tone accusatory. Jorge shrugged politely. "It's an arbor for the wheelchair lift, partially enclosed with lattice for climbing roses. Should be quite beautiful once it's done. We have the HOA's subcommittee approval." Delilah sniffed. "No one consulted me about these final plans." Jorge politely replied, "I believe Mr. Fairchild shared it with the architectural subcommittee, which is chaired by Ms. Gardner, correct?" The plan was approved. She turned to see Lauren stepping onto the porch. "This arbor is more intrusive than I expected," Delilah said sharply. "The guidelines might require it to be set back further." Lauren frowned. The subcommittee inspected. "We measured everything to ensure compliance. It's within the porch boundary, not extending onto the walkway." Delilah's mouth tightened. "We'll see about that. I'll schedule another review." This structure could be considered a porch expansion. She pivoted and stormed off, leaving Jorge and Lauren exchanging exasperated looks. Hours later, an official email arrived from Delilah, copying the entire HOA board, calling for a porch expansion review. She claimed the arbor might violate side setbacks or the maximum porch coverage ratio. Eloise Gardner quickly wrote back to quell the drama, explaining that the arbor had already been included under the same permit that covered the wheelchair lift enclosure. Still, Delilah pressed for an in-person check, determined to find any technicality to exploit. A new wave of anxiety swept through Lauren and Alexander. Even though they believed the plan was bulletproof, Delilah's capacity for stirring trouble seemed endless. Would she manage to sabotage the arbor's completion? Or would the board finally put its foot down? A week passed, and the arbor construction neared completion. The wooden lattice was installed, and a series of potted rose bushes awaited planting around the base. Their budding pink and white blooms promised a vibrant display once they took root and climbed the supports. At Delilah's insistence, Philip scheduled a final walkthrough with the board. They arrived on a sunny afternoon. By now, the tension surrounding Delilah's crusade had grown tiresome to most. Even those who were once ambivalent about the lift recognized how petty the standoff had become. Lauren and Alexander greeted them on the porch, where a gentle breeze stirred the scent of fresh cedar. The arbor stood gracefully, framing the lift. The subcommittee members, Eloise, Tom, and Richard, murmured words of admiration. "It's lovely," Eloise said, smiling at Lauren. "The color matches the porch rails perfectly." Tom Castillo chuckled softly. "This actually enhances the curb appeal. I'd say it might even raise property values around here, not lower them." Delilah's eyes flicked over each post and beam, searching for a flaw. She pointed to the top of the arbor. "How tall is this structure?" "We have a maximum porch feature height limit of 8 feet. Lauren nodded. "It's 7.5 feet at the highest point. We measured carefully." Richard Lee verified with a tape measure, confirming the dimension. Delilah pursed her lips again. She turned to the side boundary. "And the side setback line?" Is this arbor crossing it? Philip stepped forward. I have the site plan right here. The arbor is well within the property lines. Actually, it's about 4 feet from the boundary, which exceeds the required minimum of 3 feet for porch elements. Stymied again, Delilah resorted to scolding about the future vines. We must ensure these plants don't grow out of control, creating an eyesore or attracting pests. Alexander replied gently, We'll prune and maintain them. We're dedicated gardeners. I have a horticultural background from my architecture work. Trust me, we'll keep it neat. Realizing she had run out of plausible objections, Delilah let out a frustrated sigh. She tried one last angle. I suppose the structure might look decent now, but what about 5 years from now? Who's to say it won't fall into disrepair? Philip, his patience wearing thin, replied diplomatically. HOA guidelines always require homeowners to maintain their properties. If, in 5 years, it's neglected, we can address it at that time. Right now, everything is in perfect compliance. After conferring briefly, the subcommittee formally gave its blessing. With that, the final hurdle was cleared. Delilah, defeated, stood with a rigid posture as the others exchanged congratulatory handshakes. On the surface, she maintained a polite mask, but her narrowed eyes revealed simmering resentment. Within days, the rose bushes were planted at the arbor's base. Lauren carefully coaxed their vines into the lattice, attaching them loosely with garden ties. Tiny blooms began to open, adding splashes of soft color to the once stark metal of the lift. Residents walking by paused to admire the transformation. Some knocked on the Fairchild's door to compliment the design or ask for gardening tips. With the arbor in place, the wheelchair lift no longer stuck out as an imposing apparatus. Instead, it felt like an integrated feature of the porch, an archway of blossoms that conveniently rose when the lift platform ascended. Even Alexander, who initially just wanted a functional solution, found joy in the unexpected beauty. As more neighbors saw the success of the arbor concept, a ripple effect began. Another resident who had a ramp installed for his elderly father asked if he, too, could build a flowering trellis. Eloise Gardner, who managed part of the architectural subcommittee, started championing accessible landscaping as a new design frontier for Bayview Oaks. The idea that accessibility and aesthetics could coexist, enhancing each other, gained real traction. Meanwhile, Delilah retreated from the spotlight. For a time, she continued to complain privately about the creeping vines overtaking our neighborhood, but few paid heed. She found herself increasingly isolated at board meetings, where her old alliances had evaporated. Tom Castillo took over a leadership role on the architectural subcommittee, with Eloise's enthusiastic support. Even Richard Lee, once neutral, was openly courteous but distant toward Delilah. Lauren and Alexander finally felt at peace. The months-long struggle had shown them the best and worst of HOA politics. Yet the final outcome was a testament to community, compassion, and a bit of creative problem-solving. Whenever Alexander used his lift now, he couldn't help but smile at the gentle perfume of roses around him. In the end, Delilah's opposition had only inspired a more beautiful solution. Though the arbor's success was evident, Delilah refused to concede absolute defeat. One last time, she tried to stir up controversy by distributing flyers claiming the vines would attract bees, creating a hazard for passers-by with allergies. She plastered dramatic slogans like, "Your child's sting could be next," around the neighborhood. It was a desperate move. Parents of actual children who played around Bayview Oaks found the flyer laughable. Bees were a normal part of suburban flora. No one believed that a few rose bushes presented an apocalyptic risk. The small uproar fizzled in days. Sensing her waning influence, Delilah quietly announced she would not seek re-election to the HOA board. A rumor circulated that she was considering selling her house and moving closer to her sister's home in another state. Some neighbors saw this as a welcome development, while others, more compassionate, merely hoped she'd find fulfillment elsewhere. A few weeks later, Delilah's home went on the market. She left no formal farewells. A new family purchased it, coincidentally, a couple with a child who used a special walker. They took one look at the newly blossoming arbor across the street and felt encouraged by the neighborhood's acceptance of accessibility. In the months following Delilah's departure, Bayview Oaks found itself calmer and more unified. The story of the wheelchair lift that sparked a battle gradually became a cherished anecdote, a testament to how cooperation could triumph over pettiness. Visitors who strolled down Sycamore Lane were greeted by the vision of a charming porch arbor, vines weaving through latticework, clusters of roses in pink and cream. If they looked closely, they might notice the lift's platform inside, ready to raise or lower at the push of a button. Lauren eventually found a home of her own nearby, but she visited her father often. Alexander, with newfound independence, sometimes joined neighbors for morning coffee on the porch, discussing gardening tips or local news. The arbor became a conversation piece, a proud symbol of bridging function and beauty. At future HOA meetings, references to Delilah's fiasco prompted chuckles rather than groans. Philip and Eloise continued championing inclusive design guidelines. Residents with mobility challenges felt freer to request modifications without fearing undue scrutiny. The change was subtle but significant. In time, the vines thickened, producing lush blooms every spring and summer. Lauren added small fairy lights woven among the roses, so at night the arbor glowed softly, transforming the porch into a magical entrance. Alexander often sat outside with a warm drink, gazing at the sky through the filigree of leaves and blossoms. Rarely did he think about the old battles now. For the rest of Bayview Oaks, the arbor stood as living proof that practicality and aesthetics needn't clash, that a wheelchair lift could be hidden not out of shame, but embraced with artistry. No longer was there talk of ugly machinery. Instead, new neighbors saw only a graceful arch wreathed in flowers, quietly serving its important purpose. And so ended the tale of HOA Karen, who tried to slam a wheelchair lift for ruining the porch aesthetic and inadvertently inspired a more beautiful, inclusive solution. The sweet fragrance of roses carried on the breeze, reminding everyone that empathy and creativity can flourish, especially when pruned of small-minded disapproval. In the end, Bayview Oaks blossomed into a better, kinder place, and the final seeds of Delilah's discontent drifted away on the wind, never to take root again.